Facebook, which is great. Those folks do the Facebook thing.
I know, not having a Facebook anymore. I'm like, this is wonderful. Love that it still works.
We'll just give it a couple more minutes for a few more people to tune in. Welcome, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
All right, we're at 7 o'clock, and there's already a good number of folks here, so I think we'll go ahead and get started with some of the housekeeping items. This is the third of the speaker series for the fall, as the theme, as you know, is designed for aging, dying, and dignity. It's been really amazing to be able to host this series and to feature so many important organizations and people and things. So thank you all for your shared interest in this topic. I know for some people it can be a little bit uncomfortable or even taboo to talk about, and that's why we're doing it, because it doesn't need to be taboo. It's inevitable if you're alive. So for the folks in Zoom, we're going to be monitoring the Q&A and the chat. This format's going to be slightly different than previous series talks. We're going to be doing, it's going to be more of like a conversation, more of like you're watching a podcast. I think that's the best way to describe it. And so you're welcome to ask questions as we progress, but we might save them until the end, just to allow us to continue the thread of the conversation. But we definitely encourage you to use the chat and Q&A, and we'll try and connect with those towards the end of this hour that we have together. For the folks tuning in on Facebook, you're also more than welcome to put your questions in the chat, and I'll check in on that at the end as well. And if you have friends that aren't able to make this tonight, we are recording it. So this, as well as the previous two talks, are available on the Yes Tomorrow YouTube page. If you just type in youtube.com/YesTomorrow, you'll be able to find them. And we have another talk next week, and that will round out the series. So yes, I think that's all the housekeeping. So I'm at Yes Tomorrow, as you might be able to tell from the model right there. And Casey is just slightly west of here in Colchester, Vermont. So we're both tuning in from the native Abenaki land. We had the opportunity to chat on Sunday as like a precursor conversation to the conversation we're going to be having tonight. And I'm really excited to have Casey here.
I am so happy to be here. And when we were talking about this, I had said, well, why don't we introduce each other as opposed to introducing ourselves? So I'm going to introduce Rachel Wiley, who is responsible for curating this series. And I'm just so thankful for that. I'm excited for everybody to be here for this, but also all four of the conversations. I know what's happening next week is going to be amazing, and what's already happened has been just so powerful. So Rachel grew up in California and has a degree in community and regional development from UC Davis. Beyond college and her work at Yes Tomorrow, Rachel has pursued training in various somatic practices and embodied leadership, and completed certificates for herbalism and being a birth doula. The alchemical mix of her formal education and additional training have proven to be a solid foundation for supporting herself, her family, friends, and wider communities as they navigate challenging experiences in their lives. And I'm just so happy to be in conversation with her.
Ditto. Well, thank you, Casey. Casey Engels, my co-host, for the evening. Casey has a background in systems thinking, facilitation, international permaculture, and project management. She's also a Yes Tomorrow instructor teaching full systems and design thinking. She has a couple classes online later this year. She's also a certified death doula. As a founder of Willowwood Deathcare, Casey supports folks in designing towards end-of-life consideration, experiences, and plans. In this realm, she is strongly oriented towards co-creation, inclusivity, equity, and agency, and believes that by tending to process and emergence applies as much to the end of any cycle as its beginning.
It's kind of fun to hear yourself introduced by someone else. Doesn't sound like me, but I guess it is me. So here I am. So when Rachel and I talked about this, I was thinking, okay, speaker series, I don't really want to, it's not my style to just sort of show up and share information. And I don't have a product or a project that's something that we would want to, at least for me, sort of hold in this space right now. But as we started talking, we thought having a conversation in public was going to be the best sort of creative solution for this. And we really had some dynamic conversation in general. So what I would like to do to start us off is to just give a little bit of, I'm going to do the world's most tiny deck on design and death together. So I'm going to share my screen and just give a little primer on something that can set the edges and the tone of what we're talking about after the deck. So here we go. Just going to pop this up right now. And I think we're good to go. Great. So death and design. We are basically here to explore that little red messy marker space right between those two things. And I think for some of you, if it is aligned with everyone I've had conversations with, it's either incredibly unfamiliar, fear-based and rooted and kind of uncomfortable and awkward, like the first dance at 7th grade or something, or just an old friend, something that you do think about a lot and talk about, and everything in between. So any way that you're showing up here today is exactly where we're all at together. And we're really glad you're here. And I love the idea of just being able to talk through this with you. So throw things in the chat as we go, and I will just move on to the next slide. So instead of sharing with you an exhaustive list of what is design or sort of theory and philosophy, I thought it would be nice to keep it nice and short. So key elements that apply to both death and design, in my belief, is are curiosity, empathy, and creativity. So any design or designer really there's a level of having to have some inquiry and have a sense of curiosity about what it is that you're looking into and what it is you're the adventure that you're about to go on. And having empathy and creativity is sort of our natural dance in that process. And anyone that's familiar with Yestermorrow has likely heard of the design build spiral. So all three of these elements, these three key elements of curiosity, empathy, and creativity, lead to the process of design or designing. And this is a simplified explanation, but just to give us a little context. The design build spiral is this iterative process of designing, building, and working through what you're doing and constantly sort of restructuring or revisiting. So you're refining your process and maybe sometimes going backwards down that spiral and having to work your way back up to tweak and learn as you go. It's also very similar to a design thinking spiral. That's used in design thinking education quite a bit, where it's a little bit more, there's 4 elements, and it's define, iterate, prototype, and evaluate. So you're defining your challenge or your design challenge or your problem. You're iterating on that. Maybe you're doing some focus groups, some conversations, and then you're prototyping. Sometimes your product, but also maybe just your service. And then you evaluate and you kind of swing right back around to the start, and then you keep going back up. All of those things work in tandem as the output is a tool for connection, a tool for exchange. So that's really that sweet spot where design and death are actually much better friends than They sound like they might be. Um, okay, so we've got this imperative that death offers to iterate and to investigate. And currently, there's a social energy around this. COVID, obviously, the pandemic has brought this right into the forefront of all of our minds and lives, and we are living it, we are experiencing it, we are considering it and thinking about it, hearing about it every day. And there's sort of three ways that I just wanted to give examples of how design shows up with either end of life services or the death industry, but also just the experience itself, the experiential human basic inevitability of dying. And so the first, I have the physical and spatial design. This amazing, amazing project is as a redesign of a funeral home. So this designer and this architect had the explicit goal to quote, break the discomfort of an unconsidered space and make it worthy of a send-off, which I think is really beautiful, to just really kind of get in there and change everything that you might expect about a funeral home. The bright white, the light reflecting, the incredible glass on the right, you'll see sort of the glass wall where folks gather. And with this building, there are 3 rooms that lead attendees through the process. That's sort of the most standard process for the processional of a funeral in this location. The designers happen to be in Amsterdam. And I thought what was really beautiful is just this sort of first image of that casket sort of sitting, really the send-off is what sort of resonates right there with me. And then just the surrounding of nature and sort of returning to the earth is reflected in that. And that's something that the designer also spoke to. And then we get into the personal. So with personal inquiry and self-design, it's a little bit more of a sort of murky subject. I think with Yes Tomorrow, obviously, we have a more clear understanding. There's something tangible about what is the physical space or what are the physical things that we're designing. But there's also a personal experience in all of this. And this artist, Tamara Hala, she had been working with what's called a personal Kanban board. So it's not the art itself. This is merely her, the background of her life, her day to day. And she realized she was experiencing quite a bit of anxiety and death anxiety and just, or sort of a avoidance of wanting to think about that or talk about it. So she added, the Kanban board has 3 sections that are scheduled, doing, and done for all of your tasks. And you're supposed to look at it and interact with it every day. So she added a little sticky note with just the word die on it, because that was something that she is doing and that she will do eventually. And somebody else will have to move it to done, I guess. But essentially, I loved the way that it was just the simplest, kind of levity infused way to break that pattern of mind and that thought process and sort of have an everyday confrontation in a way that's just the most micro step towards acceptance and towards understanding. And then we have social design. So there's there's artists that do social practice. There's a lot of social work and hospice design and hospitals and the healthcare industry, the funeral industry, all of that, but also just experience between humans. I think the physical space at the first part also speaks to this, in that it's about the actual experience of folks gathering. And what does a gathering look like? How might you want to spend your time, or have your loved ones and your community spend their time together in sending you off? For this one, I chose 2 really lovely, interesting projects. One you will be likely familiar with. But the first one is where it says, "A hospice is not a death house," is from a hospice redesign project by Fuel 4 is a healthcare innovation company, but they were redesigning what they called a hospitable hospice. So they really have a sort of branding and approach around what a hospice is not. So a hospice is not a hospital. It's not something to be feared. It's not depressing to work in. And ultimately, it's not a death sentence. So they really wanted to sort of shift what is a hospice by way, what is it not? And then they really edge the design for what they call tomorrow's hospice. So they really wanted to integrate a hospice as a part of living society and have it be in a location that was close to libraries, close to schools, sort of a more integrated approach to folks that are in hospice, and bringing them out of the shadows and out of the corners of our social experience right into the front of mind and as a part of our society, honoring them and their existence. And then we've got Recompose, which if you saw the talk last week, you know, if you know, you know. And if you didn't, you can go to the Yes Tomorrow YouTube and go watch it and understand why I have this up here. But Recompose is really, there's obviously an incredibly personal element to the work that Katrina Spade and the team at Recompose do. It's obviously about dying and being buried, well, buried in this amazing composting situation, which is called natural organic reduction. But why I have it here in the social design is because it really just applies to these broad environmental issues and deals with soil remediation, and then edges into what the social shift is that's possible with how folks perceive what can be done with your body once you die, if especially if you don't belong to or are of a culture where you have a very sort of clear pathway or rigid pathway, or if you're sort of thinking, okay, I would like my personal values and my environmental impact to be carried through after I die, and here's how I can do something about it. So it really changes the conversation socially around death, but also around just what happens with our bodies and what we can do about it to continue the conversation after we pass away. So, what are we talking about when we do say end of life? It seems obvious. We mean what we say, and we say what we mean. We mean actually dying, but also there's end of life is something where I think oftentimes, especially from the death doula perspective, people tend to think, okay, you work primarily with folks who are terminally ill or aging, or with community or family members that have had someone pass away. And that's 100% true. And it's also true that there are these more divergent, open, sort of exploration-based points in this work where there's the eventuality, but if you feel like it's not so soon, that's a perception because we're all in the midst of dying. So really, it is something that we can start talking about now, essentially, like when the time to start designing for your end of life is immediately. And both of those present in a lot of ways a unique design challenge. With both of those, there's different language that comes up that are sort of the norms around care, or around the same thing with hospice, or around what our families did or what my friends do. And so there's those norms, and then there's also just that both are a response to something that's either happening or something that's just sort of percolating for you. So both of them are a unique design challenge in that they are that sort of initial spark for how to sort of start considering and talking about end of life. And we're back to this. We're back to this Venn diagram and this messy red marker-ish that is really just the real goal is that the Venn diagram brings this to an opportunity to shift ourselves. And if you're having fear, if you're having anxiety, just think about that little space where there's just this micro movement that you can make, or this micro step to say, okay, I can live here for just a minute a day. I can just hang out in this messy spot. And then there's the opportunity to start a conversation with a friend, to start a conversation with a family member, or to visit a death cafe. There's all of these social, I feel like the social energy around it, there's so much that is just brimming right now. If you are on Instagram or social media and sort of interested in the death positivity realm or death doula work or anything, you just see a lot more information, a lot more creative solutions to how we can sort of bring this conversation and bring death into the front of mind for more of an everyday and make it part of living. The other thing that comes out of this is there's a little agency, there's authentic ownership over your experience, but also over your story. So how do you leave things? What's your legacy work, essentially? And then equity is very important to me. I just think a lot about who gets to have these conversations, who gets to think about this, because not everybody has the time or the capacity or the financial situation or what have you to consider these things. So I like to think about what are ways that we can bring equity to this conversation and make it more accessible, not just for everyone who's already here, but for folks who haven't shown up or don't have the time to show up right now. And then obviously, meaning is a nice overt effect, but really just finding a way to deepen your relationship and crafting something I think about a lot is crafting your own voice or language for this work. So, a lot of times in visual and design and music or any creative realm, there's a lot of talk about finding your voice and finding your visual voice, finding your like your visual language. What is your visual language going to be, and how do you show up in the world? And so I thought about that, like how do we like reclaim, not necessarily rebrand, but how do we reclaim words that aren't necessarily aligned with what we learned about death or what we've carried forward so far? How do we reclaim that and move it forward in a new way? And how do we essentially like bring ourselves to that as fully as possible? So what? I don't want to be here. This is so uncomfortable. It's death. I hate it. Like, I don't want to talk about it. I get it. But something that came up in the conversation with Rachel is that we said, okay, I don't want to just normalize it. I want to detabooify it. Well, I don't know if that's a word, but who cares? So we've kind of held on to this. We just want to take the taboo away, and that's why we're sitting here. That's why I'm doing this little primer. That's why we're going to have a conversation. Just make it more approachable. Conversations, just the shortest conversation, but just the vulnerability that it takes to say, I'm thinking about death. What do I do about that? That is just a small step that we can make to just bring this into the sort of broader conversation in our communities and shift the tone away from fear and discomfort to something that's just a little bit more, it's honored. It's part of our experience, and it's going to come. So what an awesome thing to sort of own it a little bit more before it does, and own it now instead of after the fact, essentially. And just a little plug for my newly launched official business. I've been doing this work for a while in a consulting way, but I did finally bite the bullet and establish Willowwood Deathcare. So I am an operating death doula at this point and certified, and I do like the fact that the way I'm approaching this is very iterative and very open to co-creation. So depending on these talks and other conversations I have, Willowwood is incredibly flexible format so that I can be responsive. I'm starting out with, very specific services, but at the same time, these conversations are a huge part of it. So I'm really excited to officially be in this space with you. I will stop sharing my screen. Okay. Did that work, Rachel? Great, thank you.
Yeah, that was wonderful. It was great to see the things that we talked about in a beautiful format.
Thank you, Canva. Just learned not that long ago. So I guess now we're thinking we will we're just going to move into this what we're calling a considered conversation. So there's nothing scripted about this. We did have a few conversations prior, thankfully. We're not going in totally cold. But we are also, I think it's really important to note too that this is not like a resource or a how-to or a skills-based conversation. It is something, like you said, it's a podcast you can see, but there's absolutely no fancy sound design or amazing team behind it, making it sound just right, balancing all the audio. So I'll just start out with, first of all, just thanking you, Rachel, for curating this series and for everyone showing up. It's so essential. And I think what's really cool about it being at Yes Tomorrow is that it's like a little bit of a surprise. I feel like some folks are like, Why? Okay, I get yeah, it's cool, but why? So can you I wanna give a little context to it, but before we do, for the sort of personal context, can you speak to that just a hair?
Yeah. Oh, could you? I think I'm getting some feedback
Yeah.
on my voice. Oh, wait, that's better now. Okay. Yay, tech issues. um, so the big thing that made me want to host a series around this topic was the large number of losses that I experienced in the last year. I know a lot of people have experienced very close losses, and often too many of them than that what we want to have happen. But last year, end of September, my father died from ALS, and I had the opportunity to spend a month and a half helping care for him towards the end of his life, and that visceral experience of caregiving, and like in that very acute way, needing to adjust and adapt to his changing health situation was really powerful and impactful for me. And then my aunt was, she died of Parkinson's, and talking to my mom and my cousin about their experience with her care, it's really put into perspective the many different ways that it can go. And then my mom, who is alive and healthy, has been like doing all of the stuff that she can now to be as prepared as possible. So, um, having that big picture and several different examples of how to prepare or how you have to respond if there wasn't preparation for the end of life really struck a chord and felt like something important to talk to people about and to just have those conversations. Um, and it changed my life, and I'm grateful for it even through the pain. But
Yeah, I love that too because when we talked initially too, there's these sort of tangential things that are happening around yestermorrow with the physical spaces, like what Wheelpad or Building Hope, which is coming next week, are doing. And then, I think sometimes too, like, oh, what are the other things that could be integrated with this? Because everyone, you've had an incredibly powerful and sort of concentrated experience, and everyone's going to experience this or has in one way or another. And how do we, with yestermorrow, how do we keep that conversation not just in this sort of compact space, which is an amazing sort of like lift off and sort of amplifier for it, but maybe in the future there's build your own casket or weave your own basket, uh, workshops that really that keep it tangentially focused and keep it sort of as part of the continuing conversation. And I really appreciate that you have fully brought your personal experience to this work and can sort of interpret it this way, which is really, really fantastic. I think too, just I guess just briefly before we forget to, in case anyone doesn't know what a death doula is, so Rachel is trained as a birth doula, and so very similarly, there are birth midwives, and a death doula is kind of exactly the same, but just on the other end of the spectrum. And it's someone who does that care work and that support work for either the person who is dying or the family and community, or all of the above, sort of before, during, and after the process of death, similarly to being a birth midwife. So I think that's important to note. But I also love that you bring that perspective. You bring this sort of like just complete full spectrum from the beginning to the end. And then, right back around. Like, okay, how do these two spots reflect each other? And I'm sure that was really helpful in your approach with your family and with your father, I'm sure.
yes,
So,
yeah,
something we talked about was like basically like in caring for your dad, you had these micro opportunities every day, every hour to sort of shift how you were doing things and how you were caring for him and how you were communicating and connecting with him. So could you speak to
yeah,
that a little bit?
definitely. Yeah, I was incredibly struck by how useful my birth doula training was for caring for my dad. So much of being a birth doula is being attuned to the person who's giving birth and their support if they have other people around with them. and being able to kind of read and hear their needs, even if they're not able to say them in the clearest way, and having the patience to be able to, and curiosity to ask the questions to help understand exactly what it is they need and how you can best support them. And with my dad, he had the type of ALS that started with his throat. So he wasn't able to speak clearly for over a year and a half before he died. And so there was a lot of, like I had to be patient as he wrote responses. And as his hands started to become weaker, I had to figure out other ways to communicate with him. And to sit and be patient to allow him to communicate at the pace he was able. Like there's a point where, it'd be so easy to be like, oh, we'll take him outside, put him on the back porch in the sunshine, or like, okay, it's time to feed him through his feeding tube. Like, we'll just do that. But trying to be like, hey, Dad, do you want to go outside? Or do you want to sit over here? Do you want to lay down for a nap? And like giving options with numbers so that he could communicate to me, and actually sitting and waiting and giving him the honor of being able to respond and ask for what he needs or tell you what he wants. And that was one big one, I think. It was something that I noticed the other people that were helping care for him didn't often do. Because like I have that skill set from being a birth doula, and not everyone has that skill set. And so, to be able to model that for my sister, she's a paramedic, so she's got some really good skills, and like also was quite patient, but also modeling for his wife and for other people coming in, like how to be patient. And even because his neck was not strong and his head was like this, to be able to like get down on the ground so that he could see me and I could look at him in the eye instead of talking to him from above when he can't lift his head up. Like those very small ways of honoring him in his stage of life, which was actively dying and actively having his body deteriorate and having his ability to communicate and function and care for himself just be on a constant decline. And taking that time to like be attuned to each change and trying to adapt my own behavior with each change as it came in order to preserve as much of his dignity and agency to make decisions as I could.
Yeah, there's so much in that in terms of just the exhaustion that can come with that too. It's a very constant and not exhausting necessarily in a bad way. It can be very energizing, but that is constantly shifting and being as present as possible is so energy draining. And I think speaking to that is something that we talked about as well, but just how to just change your mode of communication and your mode of being present with him just enough that he could be seen. And then also something it makes me think of is something I saw recently, which is death and dying is not a medical event. And this really speaks to that. Like we treat it like a medical event. We hyper medicalize, we go into function mode. We want to check all of those boxes and talk to all the doctors and do all the things right. And that I hear that, and that makes so much sense. But keeping that sort of in mind, that this is not just a medical event. This is a person is still living through this. And how do you sort of bring respect to that in the moment?
And I was in that role too when helping care for my dad, of like, being on the phone, writing notes from the doctors and like making sure we had the appointments figured out, and like in that hyper productivity planning, how can we work with this within the system kind of a mode. But yeah, I noticed that it felt really good to me to be able to like, be helping feed him through the feeding tube and just like be sitting with him on the couch in silence because he can't talk to me. And like really like allowing myself moments of resting into being deeply in presence with this person that I know isn't going to be physically here much longer. And, that I feel like that's another powerful, micro opportunity of, I've talked with some friends who also have their parents are currently, or their fathers are currently dying of ALS. And my biggest message to them, like the gift of ALS is that there is time, and the other gift is that there isn't hope, really. There's no cure for it. And so it's like, at some point in the next 3 months to a year to 2 years, depending on when the diagnosis occurs, that they're no longer going to be here. And so how do you make the most of that time? And, scaling out, like, everyone is going to die. And so how can we apply that same gentle awareness of our mortality and the mortality of the people in our lives to really make the most of our relationships in the moment now? And, recognize that every interaction that we have with someone could be our last, could be their last. And I've found that has helped me move through the world with better grace and forgiveness and empathy, and a willingness to connect with people on a more open and vulnerable level than I did before.
Yeah. It's interesting too, because now I'm thinking about, we talked about how with your father, you have kind of the not antithesis, but a completely different experience with on the other side of your family with your mother, which we've got the blessing to talk about.
Yeah. Mom's watching right now. Hi, Mom.
Thank you. And both are wonderful. It's just, I think it would be really cool because I feel like probably a lot of folks, maybe not, people don't have necessarily experienced that someone in their life is like fully prepared for this or has gone through it in another way before. But I don't know if you could speak to sort of that like reversal.
Totally. Yeah. So like with my dad, it was very much like as his health declined, we figured out how to respond to it in the best way that we could. With my mom, we've been having conversations around death for years. Like now looking back, I'd go home to visit and she'd be like, let me show you like where there's a copy of the will. And like there's sticky notes on the back of these paintings, what goes to you, what goes to your sister. Like, she's prepared and she's got like everything planned out. She has her like, I think she even has what flowers she wants at her like funeral and the songs and songs that she wants. And she has her like plot paid for. It's like she's got it all figured out. And we are constantly in conversation about it too. Like if something changes in her will, she'll let us know and give us an updated copy. And like, it's helped us to it is a part of our conversations as mother and daughters. And it's great, and she's like got all that paperwork done. Because I know with my dad, it was like, we got to get an advance directive. Like, this is really important. And like, do you have this? Do you have that? And like having to put that extra, use the extra like energy and brain power to try and make sure those things were in order so that it hopefully wasn't as hard after he died. And to not have to expend that because it's already taken care of and I know how to access it is amazing. And then also over the last handful of years, I'm not quite sure how long it's been, but she's been doing some renovations at her home so that she's able to age in place. So like next week we have Nora Spencer from Hope Renovations talking about what they're doing in North Carolina, training women in the trades by doing renovations for elderly people to age in place, which is amazing. And my mom's just been doing it. She's like, yeah, I don't want to end up in a nursing home. So like, let's redo the bathroom so I could like roll a wheelchair into the shower if I need to. And it's beautiful. And it's like, she's ready. She has this beautiful space to be able to not have to like completely change her life if something were to happen where she needed a wheelchair or something like that. Like, it's already part of her life. The only difference would be how she's interacting with it, and that would be easeful compared to only having showers with tubs. which was what my dad had. And it was a lot of work bathing him and trying to figure out the suction cup grab bars that the VA gave us and all of that. So, I'm very grateful for my mom being such a forward thinker.
I was going to say, what a gift.
Yeah.
I mean, that is such a gift. And I also feel like it's so unusual. Like I mostly hear stories of folks who are like, I think I know where I think my parents have a will, or I think my dad has a will. I'm not sure. I mean, even myself, in some ways, I have a sense, I know that there is one and I know where it is. But besides that, it's not quite the conversation. It's not the consistent conversation. And that's all okay. But I saw that somebody in the chat had asked, like, do you have any tips for like normalizing conversations about death amongst friends and family? And I think, things like this, but also like the gentle ease in. You don't have to sit down with like, okay, here we are, we're going to task, we've got, here's my will, here's the sticky note, here's the thing. That's great for a close relationship where you kind of know to expect it. And just being able to speak from your experience and say, hey, I'm thinking about this. I think I'm going to do this. Have you ever done it before? See what happens in that conversation and test the waters, but also just continuously talking about what you want to with it is also necessary, because part of the challenge with it being a taboo is that the more we want to talk about it, the more we think about how do we talk about it just so. And I don't think this is what the original question asker meant, but sometimes that holds us back, and that perfection of how we might bring it up holds us back. There's also some really cool resources that if you're not in a family or in a community where there is someone who's fully at the ready to say, here's all of the things, there's this amazing game called the Death Deck that is sort of an interactive card game. There's just quite a few really creative resources for that. So it doesn't have to be that you've got, sort of there's an advanced directive online called 5 Wishes that is also a great resource and can guide you through, but it's definitely much more sort of progressed. It's not the start of a conversation. Doing that, there's another program called Death Over Dinner. You can sort of organize and have a dinner that has a specific conversation element to it that is about death. And it doesn't have to be a super deep dive. It doesn't have to be, right into the center of it at the start, but it is kind of a cool way to gather people with an intentional conversation that will then maybe eventually get you to the place where you're like, oh, we are actually talking about this regular. That's kind of cool. And like, I feel comfortable bringing this up. How do I do that? So I love that there are those options for someone who doesn't have it right, really like at the front of your existence, in the front of your space with your family. Something else we talked about too that I wanted to check in on was, there's all these, I think you spoke to it a little bit, but there are all these shifts and changes and sort of like mini design challenges that you went through with the experience with your father. And I was saying, and what now? So you went through this whole experience a year ago, just about like just over a year ago. So this is an interesting timing for this conversation. So you go through this whole experience, you have this acute, very specific shift in your, and in your awareness, but also your experience and your behavior and how you're relating and problem solving and communicating. And then it's been a year. So how is that? Yeah. How is that a part of your life now? And sort of what have you done with that? And how have you noticed it come up?
Oh, yeah. Good question. Yeah, I mean, around like a few months after my dad was diagnosed in early 2020, one of my coworkers, one of their parents passed away. And so it was kind of weirdly wonderful to have another person who had that experience so incredibly close to mind and close to heart. And it was very awkward at first, being like, so how are you doing? And, and she'd be like, terrible. Thanks for asking, which by the way is a great podcast. And, it kind of just, it grew into more conversations of like, how's it going with your dad? You know, when I got back and was still trying to coordinate his care in Oregon from Vermont while working, and grieving, you know, it was a lot. But um, having companionship through the experience, from someone who wasn't experiencing the exact same loss as me, um, had it's a very special kind of comfort to it. And I'm definitely the type of person who, doesn't hesitate to share my personal experience, because I like stories, and storytelling is powerful both for the person telling their story and for the people listening. Um, I tried to be very conscious that some people might not want to talk about it. So like there kind of evolved some different versions of the story that were more raw and vulnerable than others. Um, but even being able to like name my grief, like come into work a month or so after my dad died, and to just walk into the office and say, hey, everyone, I just want to let you know that I'm having a really hard time today. And I'm going to try and be gentle with myself. And like, because no one knows your internal experience unless you tell them. And you don't have to go into a huge explanation, but just to say like, hey, it's been 6 months, but like, it's only been 6 months, even as it's already been 6 months. Like, you know, it still comes in waves, after, you know, dealing with the loss. And now being, you know, actually as of today, a year and 1 month out, um, I feel a lot lighter. And like, you know, I cried about it yesterday, like it's still present, but having I feel like I have, through sharing and my experience and talking about it, I have more conversations about death and dying more regularly in my life with more people in my life of varying degrees of closeness. And even like from hosting this series, like the number of people who have been like, hey, thanks for that. Like, I'm so glad someone's talking about it. Like, I think generally people want to talk about it, you know, and it's just, again, like, how do you normalize the conversation? And I think for me, it was like, that's how I processed. That was part of my journey. It was like sharing my story, my experience as a way to help me move through it and like take it out of just my body and realize that it's something that everyone experiences in their own way at some point in their life. So that's like, and now like in November, I'm doing a death doula training as well, which I'm very excited about. And, you know, it feels really appropriate to have the birth and the death, and, you know, having both of those be something that's part of my life, along with just living my life and along with the work that I do and my creative pursuits, and that death is part of life. Like, that's kind of what I hold it. It's on my mind, and not in a dark way, but just it's on my mind, just as it's on my mind that the sunset was beautiful tonight, you know.
It really was. It was
So
amazing.
beautiful.
That's, yeah, I feel like what you're really talking about is, I mean, you're really, it's a paradigm shift for
Mhm.
you. And paradigm shifts can happen, you know, in these multiplicity of multiple levels. And then your position to that is really what you're sort of shifting as well.
Mhm.
You're saying like, okay, I'm going to take this experience, I'm going to carry it with me, maybe exactly the same, or I'm going to carry it with me and sort of shift it and remold it, or, you know, weave it into something else. But then it becomes, I mean, which is appropriate because you're a weaver, but then it, you know, you're carrying that thread forward. And I think there's something to be said for, um, you know, talking about death out over here. Yes, that's important. And talking about your own experience. It doesn't have to be a therapy moment. It doesn't have to be a therapeutic experience with someone, or you don't have to overshare. And owning that story and telling that story is part of the shift and part of the sort of, there is a design challenge in that in a way too, because like you said, you're sort of, there's one story that's for some audience members, and there's another story that's for other audience members, and where do
Yeah.
these things live? And it doesn't mean neither are true, or because both are true. So how do you carry it forward?
Mhm.
Just and give it that honor. And also something we spoke about was like just telling your dad's story, telling your story with your dad is part of honoring his legacy, part of honoring that experience for you, and also just the fact that he had this experience in life as he was dying.
Yeah, and like keeping him present, you know.
Mhm.
Every time I talk about him, like I feel him. Like he is here. He's not in body, but he is still here in a different form. And there's comfort in that too, of everybody has their own beliefs around what happens when we die. I'm kind of the camp that we have no idea and won't know until we die. But whatever experiences I have that I interpret as my father being close, that's also true. And if someone has a different experience of what, something that reminds them, or like, for me seeing cardinals, I'm like, oh, hey, it's dad. Like, I had some wacky experiences with cardinals like the month after he died. And so now I'm like, hey, cardinals, got it. And it changes over time and it's all perfect and beautiful. And if someone doesn't have any experience like that and they're like, I don't feel them anymore, that's perfect and beautiful too. And that we, as living people, we can still communicate with each other and we can talk about the people who've passed, and through doing that, like, help to keep their memory alive and also help to keep our own mortality present in a way that can also be light. Like at funerals, the number of people that will tell funny stories, or like endearing stories, and like, that doesn't have to end. And there's also, even when someone is actively dying, there is so much opportunity for like humor and playfulness, like, and that was something really beautiful with my dad. After he had like a pretty serious decline in his ability to walk, he had a cane and we got him a transfer chair as well. And there were like, he had like slipped out of something at one point. It wasn't hurt, but we're like, he can't even yell for help, so like, how do we help him communicate? And so I went to the store and I got a bike bell that I attached, like wrapped around his cane, that had 4 different settings. And one of them was like a ray gun, like pew 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 pew. And so like the next time one of his nurse aides like came by to check on him, she walked to the front door and he pointed his cane at her and was like, press the button. And he was laughing like as much as he could laugh without a voice that really worked. But it just, I could see him just light up like in pure joy. And like, finding moments like that, I think, even in conversation, death is messy, but it's also part of life, and life is messy and funny. And, how can we like not, it doesn't have to be a dark, heavy conversation, and I think finding ways to make it light with your friends and family can be fun and hard sometimes, but
Totally. I think that was something else that we had touched on, was like basically there's all this not knowing, there's all this paperwork, there's all of these sort of reframing how you're interacting with someone or with yourself. If you're sort of just contemplating it for yourself, you might be interacting with yourself in a very different way than how you talk with other people. But then part of that, like sort of developing your own language around it, is about, levity as kind of inevitably part of it. If you've ever experienced being with someone who is dying, it's 100% present because it has to be, there's a level of like that gives it the respect that it's due, honestly, because there are certain situations that are just absolutely ridiculous. And if you can't find it funny or won't find it funny, then it sort of it creates the distance between you and that person, or your with yourself in a lot of ways. And something, I mean, it just brings to mind, I think we talked about this, that a family friend of ours had he was sort of a unique person anyway. He's a unique person, and he was a sort of tall guy who had all different kind of like wild clothes that he would wear all the time, like one earring that was just a flamingo or toilet paper. So when we were little kids, we were like, what's Mike's earring gonna be? It's so cool. so excited, just like a wild character. But he had in his apartment had his coffin, which he had specially made, and it's sort of a tradition in, I think it's Ghana. I don't want to be incorrect, but I'm pretty sure. But uh, he had a replica of the shoes that he wore most of the time, which is a big red Converse shoe, just sitting in his apartment. Like, he's into outsider art. He had a whole bunch of other stuff, and then there's this huge Converse shoe, and it doesn't really look obviously like a coffin, but at the same time, like, you'd be so psyched to talk about it and think it's kind of cool. It's just like, it's just sitting there all the time. So it's like, it's fun and it's wild and it's authentic and it's also present, like that little sticky note, as much as possible. And I always thought that was so interesting. Like, it just seemed so cool to me. Like, oh, you can do that? You can get buried in a shoe? That's wild. And so just making sure to sort of keep that thread in my mind as we try to bring this conversation to folks is super important. Um, yeah, I love
Yeah.
that.
And one of the audience members, Amy, asked how weaving death into our day-to-day thinking and conversations has helped us, because Amy shared that she has some intense anxiety around death, which is very normal. And it's very, very normal. And I think I've spoken to a little bit, but for me, like, weaving it into my day-to-day thinking has allowed me to be more compassionate and more appreciative of each moment that I have. And also to, like, I think sometimes, not all the time, because no one's perfect, has helped me feel like a little bit more understanding of when things feel hard, of like, yeah, well, it's all right, it's life, and that the most challenging experience I will have, that I will not have until I'm having it, is dying. And if I can make it through what feels like, in the most dramatic high schooler way, the end of my life, it's over, it's like, it's not. And just to, yeah, I think the short answer for me is that it's helped me appreciate life more.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
you said before too, your audio might have cut out in the last session when you said this, but something about bringing your mortality more clearly into focus. Don't know if that's exactly how you said it, but I like it that way, so we can go with it. Um, and I think what's important with that is that it's not this macabre, like, oh, I'm facing death every day, we're all dying, and therefore I'm facing my mortality and the fact that that's happening every day. It's that it sort of softens the edge and sort of creates that, like, really, like, we're at Yes Tomorrow, so I'm going to use like a little sanding thing, but like, if you like sand the edge of something and just a little bit to take that sharp corner off, I think you can do that by bringing that to the front of your focus every day, and maybe some of that levity and some of that lightness to take the heaviness out of it. Because I think, at least from my perspective, I 100% honor the fact death anxiety is real, and I 100% know that it's incredibly hard to deal with if it sort of especially turns into sort of this spiral of thinking where it feels like, oh, it's inevitable, so then what am I doing here? Oh, okay, well, and you just kind of go on this loop. And that being able to sort of, the design challenge of this, obviously, but like being able to like insert a spoke in the wheel of that loop, and kind of just take that edge off by either owning it, I'm having a hard time, I'm having this anxiety, don't know what to do it, or that micro movement that artist Tamara Hala did, which is just that little note. You could say you're living instead of die. There's a reframe of, hey, this is where you're at today. And I think honestly, for me, being able to talk about my experience with, I've had multiple friends. From the time I was young, I had several friends pass away through high school. So from the time I was about 10 through my early 20s, I lost about 6 friends. And that was, I was not in a space where I had all of the tools to understand how to deal with that. And it was all very surprise experiences. And we didn't really talk about it that much. Our friends talked about it, but I think about it now, reflecting back 20 years on it. Now I think is when I'm actually owning that experience and owning that story and being able to speak to that discomfort or that ambiguity, like just the fact that it was an ambiguous experience for me. That takes that edge off as well. Just, it brings it more into focus as a conversation that we could have at any point, as opposed to something that's sort of looming in the shadows beyond us. I appreciate the question, Amy. Thank you.
And another note that I think as I had death so close to my awareness, I became more aware of the cycles of death and rebirth in nature. So like here we are at the tail end of fall in Vermont, all the leaves are falling off the trees. Hopefully not too soon, but soon there'll be snow on the ground and it's going to feel really, it's the dark months. And yet in spring, the trees bud out again, and it was interesting to have my grieving process, losing my father at the beginning of autumn, and then having the dark winter during COVID, but living alone, and then coming back out in the spring, and having the spring and the summer, being reminded that with any loss, there is still life. And I think, and as Casey was saying, finding your language for how to talk about it, maybe something that could help ease some of the anxiety is not focusing on death, but like that spoke being like, and also life comes, and also life continues and will always continue. And like with recompose, and the death, the body can help to nourish new life. And remembering, I think part of the sadness of the missed opportunity of death not being taboo is that we don't get to hold it as part of our life. Like we talk, there's all these celebrations around birth and not really much around death, besides a funeral. And to find ways to hold both of them with you at all times, or not even at all times, whenever you have capacity. I think that's a really powerful way to stay grounded in the living, even as we know that we're going to die eventually.
I love that. And I also, something that you said made me think too of, we don't have to always approach, something that I think about a lot is we don't always have to approach death, the concept of death, as just the human experience. There's the nature experience, but also sort of meaningful projects or relationships or organizational experiences. Priya Parker, who wrote a book on the art of gathering, recently posted something about highlighting this store that had existed. It was like a sort of art and curated, very like specialty shop, but that just had really unique stuff. Existed for 15 years, I think, in Portland, Oregon. And they had decided, they made the hard decision to close this year. But instead of just popping up a sign or doing a social media thing and talking about it, they actually held a funeral for their store, which is like, because it was the two of the people that ran it were just so infused in the space. It was of them, it was their identity, it was their experience. So it makes me think about like, what are the little ways that we can sort of like get ourselves used to it? And I think nature obviously is one that people turn to, but also what are other ways to practice it, practice how to show up for yourself with it. Is it, mourning a relationship that changed, or it can be so many things. So something that got lost, just these micro sort of small situations that you can practice the work, as opposed to sort of having to dive deep right into your own brain and like say like, okay, no, change, stop thinking about it. What gives you that reflection on life, and what gives you just this element of I'm just practicing, it's fine. It's like, it's not as heavy, it's not that big of a deal. So it feels a little bit less tense and less scary, I think, to approach it that way too. I'm just looking at the time and I just want to make sure if anyone...
We're like at 8 o'clock. I'm totally cool with this going over a little bit. But if anyone has any lingering questions and wants to pop them in the Q&A or chat, and then if Casey, I think I want to look back at our notes and see if we missed any big ones. I think, one thing that we did talk about too, I think I've talked to my mom about this a little bit. She's been so prepared and planning ahead for so many things, excuse me, mostly because of what she navigated through helping now with her sister's care as she was dying from Parkinson's. That was that progression of dying helped inform the choices and decisions she's made with her own preparations. But also like we can be prepared in as many ways as we can, and we still won't be prepared. Like, you know, like every experience is different for every person involved. And like I said before, my experience as a death doula, I mean, the birth doula, I was kind of a death doula for my dad too. As a doula, I should just say, was allowed me to provide care and support in a particular kind of way. And I had the skills and I had the capacity, but not everybody has the skills and not everybody has the capacity to offer care in particular ways, and that's okay. You know, like it was a lot of work. It was exhausting. I was also knew that I was only going to be doing it for about a month and a half because I had to come back to Vermont. So I had this short timeline where it's just my aunt's care was several years, and to make sure that you know, there's no obligation to be the primary caregiver for someone in your life who's dying. I feel like our primary obligation as people on this earth who will also die is just to love and to show up in the ways that we can, to offer our care and honor and respect for what they're dealing with, and be as present as we can. But there's like no shame in saying like, I cannot provide any acute care, you know, like I cannot do that because that's not something I have the ability, skills or space for energetically. That's okay. You know, like there's like, we're all figuring it out. The people who are helping and that are navigating the loss of a loved one, we're figuring it out. The person who's dying, they've never done it before. You know, they're figuring it out too. And so I think allowing a lot of spaciousness for not knowing, like we're never going to know how to be the best. There is no best. You know, it's just showing up.
I think that's incredibly important, and that's why there are folks like you and I, or other people who are in the death industry or in the death support industry, and a lot of people going into it and getting trained just in this specific time. I know it's much more sort of, people are much more aware of it now than they used to be. And something to that end, something I saw recently was like, do you know your community death worker? Do you know who this is in your community, or what support network can you start building now, instead of having to think about, you know, the actuality and the reality of dying? Like you can still do that while you do this, but weave your net, build your foundation so that you are prepared, and that, you know, there are experts in a lot of fields, and you know, no one's a full expert at dying or aging, frankly, because, you know, this is this is also about aging. So sort of infusing all of that unknowing and not knowing with an element of just kind of returning to that curiosity, creativity, and having a lot of empathy or compassion for yourself and for your neighbors and friends, bringing that to the table and kind of sticking with that. I feel like that's what's so nice about sort of the design lens on design and death is, okay, it gives me something tangible that I can look at and hold on to, and a couple of words that I can say, oh, how does that actually relate to death? What am I doing? And that then sort of brings you into action, or an actionable space that isn't quite as terrifying or sort of infused with the stress that can come with it, or the feeling of having to know everything. It's purely an exploratory process. So I think that's a great place to close our conversation. I don't know about you, Rachel, but
Yeah, that feels pretty great.
I didn't mean to do that, but it happened.
Nice. This has been really wonderful. I mean, I've been telling people the last few months, I love talking about death. Like I love it. Like, you know, I never thought I would say that, but I really so appreciate being able to have this conversation with you, and appreciate everyone who's tuned in, everyone who watches the recording. Like that in itself, it requires a little bit of bravery, and that's like a first step to thinking more about how to incorporate the idea of dying into our lives and how we live our lives. And yeah.
Remembering we wanted to leave folks with a question, rather than a statement. So just thinking about maybe what part of this or what's something that came up during this talk that you're going to take with you. And you don't have to share, but maybe share henceforth.
And maybe even share with a friend or a family member as a foot in the door to start a conversation, you know?
Exactly. And also, I just want to be clear, I'm available on, I mean, if you have Instagram, great, but you can also go to my website and fill out a form to email me. So if you have any questions sort of after this chat, I would love to answer them. I'd love to just, chat about it on the side. That's great. Or if you have any specific questions. Again, it's not, we don't have, this isn't like a big resource share. So I also understand, sometimes a little bit of a directional is really helpful. So feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Thank you, Casey.
Yeah.
Next week is our last of installment in the speaker series. I'm very excited about this one too. It's very appropriate, especially with the preparations I shared that my mom's doing. But yes, as I mentioned it earlier, Nora Spencer from not Recompose. I think I'm sleepy. From Hope Renovations. And she's going to be talking about the work that her organization is doing in North Carolina, training women in the trades for pre-apprenticeships and also doing renovations so folks can age in place. So it's a beautiful way to help more people while we're learning new skills. So I hope you'll tune in for that one. And yeah, stay in touch. You know how to get a hold of Casey, you know how to get a hold of me. And thank you so much for tuning in. See you next time.
Bye.